Hey everybody, this is John with another installment of Think Culture, and today we're going to continue on with the Sloterdijk Spheres series. Right, we're still in Volume 1 Bubbles, but we're getting pretty close to the end. And last time we talked about the Primal Companion, and we also did the Excursus on the Black Plantation. We talked about placental nihilism and the relationship developmentally. If you remember, like we talked about this no object, no subject sort of relation, the fetus has a sort of primal companion of the placenta in a pre-subjective, undifferentiated dyadic space where the child is not yet a subject, right, but part of a shared being. And this is sort of the beginning of our subjectivation, right? So this is important for Sloterdijk in terms of establishing sort of the constitution of what it means to be a human being. But we talked about that sort of stuff in the previous book, right? And in the previous chapter. And the path to individuation, to becoming a subject, it requires the death of the primal companion. Sloterdijk describes the effect of this separation, of this death, as the emergence of a hole in the being of the subject, a tear in its container being. Remember, he's thinking spatially. We are a sphere, right? We are our space. And our space, from the beginning of the process of our subjectivation, is dyadic, and then the primal companion is taken. In the age of placental nihilism, it's just thrown in the trash or whatever. And so there's this kind of ontological vacancy, right? And I think this is basically what Sloterdijk, basically what he's talking about is what Lacan calls lack, but it's spatialized. The absence isn't merely a symbolic void, it's a spheric lacuna, an ontological vacancy at the core of subjectivity. From birth, human existence is characterized not by autonomy, but by relational embeddedness. We never start out as isolated individuals. The human subject is never a monad. This is the drum that he's been beating, right? It's always already dyadic, shaped within an enclosed microcosm of intimacy and separation. As Heidegger puts it, we're being with, we're Mitsein, and not just in a social sense, but at the deepest level of subject formation. There is no one that comes before the two, right? That's our whole sort of point here. So once we're born, especially in the age of placental nihilism, the primal companion is killed, ejected, forgotten, and he compares this in this chapter to the loss of Eurydice. We're in truth, too, but the second pole is evacuated. It's our lost loved one, our lost companion. And we spend the rest of our lives trying to refill that void, to construct structures of resonance with intimate others that reestablish some kind of continuity with our lost companion, right? In this chapter, he gives us an account of how this soul space, how this microsphere is built. How we come to have something like a self, not as an isolated point, but as an enclosed relational field. And so to that end, Sloterdijk starts thematizing what he calls the outer soul, which he does by first treating the various figures that we've used historically to represent our sense of a cohabiting presence. So this is like the Socratic daimonion, the Roman genius, the guardian angel, the imaginary twin. And all of these are mythological or theological efforts to symbolize a structural reality for us. Namely, that the subject is never alone in its being. There's always an other. Not out there, but with us, right? On sort of the outer limits of our soul. Inhabiting the lacuna that formed when the primal companion was lost. Take the Roman genius, for instance. It was socially recognized as a lifelong co-dweller. He's your personal protector. He's a kind of semi-divine guide that's supposed to help you throughout your life and never be far away from you. And this was socially recognized. So you don't live alone. You live with a you, but not quite you, right? As a god kind of that's secondarily part of you in some sense. And this is what Sloterdijk calls a spheric symbiote, which is analogous to the placenta, right? Not metaphorical, but structural. A second pole within the soul space whose function is essential for us. And so what the outer soul position does, or what the daimonion does, what our our most intimate sort of other does, is it performs what he calls the membrane function. And so this second self mediates, it governs the interface between the subject and the world. It regulates the openness or closure of the self. And so when functioning properly, it permits a kind of what he calls well-tempered ecstasy. Remember, ecstasis is standing out. This is Heideggerian language. Where the subject is open enough to the world in order to grow and develop, but protected enough to not dissolve in it, right? So it's like a semi-permeable membrane, and the function of the genius or the daimonion, or the guardian angel, is to sort of dictate the flow of information, right? The flow of experience. And so it enables us to have edifying experiences, ideally, and it sort of protects us from overwhelming or catastrophic experiences, right? And you can think about this in terms of the idea of the real and trauma, right? When your membrane function isn't performed correctly, when you don't have this kind of relationship with an intimate other, the real overwhelms you. You're not able to symbolize it, and you develop pathology, right? When the membrane function fails, the result is psychopathology. On one side, the membrane might close too tightly, leading to a kind of hermetic self-enclosure, autistic withdrawal, or psychic rigidity. And on the other side, the membrane might fail to form at all, resulting in a kind of openness shock, right? You're not able to filter out the world, and so you get trauma, panic, exposure to the real with no buffer whatsoever. And these aren't just clinical terms for Sloterdijk, they're ontological failures of the form of subjectivity, failures in our sort of spheropoiesis, right? The process of forming a viable inner world for us to exist in, and so he sketches out the structure of a successful sphere using 5 key poles. He's got the here, which is sort of us, the centered point of the self, you might say. The companion, or second pole, the internal other, right? This kind of outer soul. The container, right? Which is like the environment in which their resonance is possible. The mutual accessibility of them, right? The openness between the self and the companion. They're capable of sort of constant interaction or something like that. And then you have the membrane function that's performed by the second pole, the intimate other. And this membrane function is about maintaining distinctions, maintaining distinction between the self and the other, maintaining distinction between different types of others so that we can correctly filter things out and things like that. And so developmentally, we move from a pre-subjective unity, this kind of herewith by unity of the fetus and the placenta, eventually into more and more complex structures. The mother is the first replacement for the companion, then comes the father, introducing a kind of third pole and the symbolic order in Lacanian terms, Oedipal triangulation. Eventually, the mature subject allows others into the sphere too, intimate partners, friends, gods, even institutions, and these become part of you, right? They become part of who you are. This is like the process of identification. Sloterdijk goes on to explicitly critique Lacan here, where he talks about the mirror stage, and he argues that the mirror stage is a latter kind of formation, right? And so for Lacan, the ego is formed in the mirror stage as a coherent self-image. But Sloterdijk argues that before this, there's a kind of pre-visual resonance, a self-understanding rooted not in sight, seeing yourself as a unified whole thing in the mirror that allows you to form a kind of self-image, but that we already have a kind of self-idea in the pre-visual mode, and this relates to sound, touch, warmth, rhythm. And so the child, before it experiences itself as an isolated whole thing in the visual field or something like that, it experiences itself as a body in relation, as a site of receptivity, a node of kind of a co-belonging, right? And this embodied wholeness precedes the imaginary coherence of the mirror stage. The ego as a visual ideal is only a later formation, one that actually he thinks sort of covers over the more primary spherical self-experience. He would say that it's kind of a delusion, right? It allows us to pretend that we're an isolated individual. But in reality, there is a prior form of sort of self-identification, of self-formation that isn't limited to kind of visual wholeness or something. But he also talks about like castration as a kind of foundational rupture, but he directs our attention not to the genitals but to the navel. The belly button, he says, is a kind of permanent monument to our once connectedness. It's the first castration, if you'd like. It's a literal scar from the severance of the primal companion, right? It's a monument to the fact that we used to be two, right? We used to be one thing that wasn't just us, right? We've had part of ourselves removed. We've been subject to a kind of hemiplegic operation, and the navel stands there as a monument to that fact, as a memorial. It's a symbolic organ of connectedness. The face, the genitals, the navel, he points out, are all oriented outward. All of them seek connection. They're all waiting for an other to come fill this kind of space, right? In order for our own purpose to be fulfilled, another has to appear for us. They all seek connection, and so they all indicate something about the structural vacancy in the subject, our need for supplementation. The human being is a being with a whole, right? And our existence is organized around how we fill it. At the end of the chapter, Sloterdijk begins to move from ontogeny to social ontology, and he describes cultural phenomena that reflect these same sorts of psychic structures and processes. So like he'll talk about the Siamese twin, which is a figure of monstrous intimacy. This is co-being without distance. It's a shared life, that is, with no membrane, right? And it becomes a metaphor for the refusal of separation, the desire to regress into a kind of fused unity. We've talked about this in terms of kind of the mystic urge and stuff like that in previous videos. And Sloterdijk warns us this is not good. He calls it a kind of ontological sin, right? And he writes about he also calls it ontological anarchism, right, in a kind of political mode. And he means it as a diagnosis of civilizational decay. When a culture loses the capacity to distinguish, to maintain spheres, partitions, membranes, it collapses into a kind of confusing chaos, right? The refusal to separate, to establish thresholds, to say this is not the same thing as that. This, he thinks, is kind of an ontological crime, right? And he thinks that late-stage cultures, decadent cultures, they're particularly vulnerable to this kind of crime because cultures require boundaries. They require discretion and distinction. Without them, we collapse into a kind of entropy, right? And so subjectivity, he wants to say in this chapter, is really built through kind of partitioning, distinguishing, distinctions, different poles, different nodes, and a membrane that separates things into sort of good and bad, in and out. Through the careful maintenance of psychic and ontological form, that is. The loss of the primal companion leaves a void, and then we fill it through a series of substitute companions, spiritual doubles, structured relations. When the membrane function holds and is functioning well, we grow within well-tempered microspheres. When it fails, either in the individual or in culture, the result is panic, regression, or collapse, right? And so again, he's sort of foreshadowing what's going to happen in globes and foams, connecting here the microsphere to the macrosphere, because he views this as a kind of continuous process, right? As we continue in our individuation in terms of our subjective development, which is a kind of spheropoiesis, right? Where our sphere is expanding, we're including more and more people into it, right? But in this chapter, we've been talking about the structural elements of a sphere that are necessary, their origin, what they mean as far as kind of a psychological constitution. And then, we can talk about that also in terms of, the membrane functions of a culture and things like that, because a culture has an identity too, and it's composed of people, but we get into more of that stuff later. Hopefully I'll tackle the next chapter pretty shortly. I hope this was interesting. We'll continue on from here. Thank you. Don't simply react, but think culture.